Welcome to the Public Voice Salon. We are an open dialogue on education, the arts, and social change. My name is John Braden. I'm a professor and a writer, and we are so delighted today to be in the home of Frances Fox Pivon, one of the leading intellectuals in our country. She is a political sociologist and a prolific author. She was the co-author of the famous Pivon-Cloward Strategy, which was an underpinning of the left in the 1960s, for which she got on Glen Beck's enemies list. And I say, if you make that list, power to you. That's a badge of honor. We don't hear much from Glen Beck these days, but Frances Fox Pivon is here with us. We're in her lovely Morningside Heights apartment, just enjoying a cup of coffee and just a wonderful soiree. And we're going to check in with her. We have the whole hour with Frances. We're so delighted to be with her today and to learn something about her life and how she developed as an intellectual. And also, let's start with the current political situation. Mr. Donald J. Trump is now the President of the United States. He's from Queens, New York. You're also from Queens. What happened? How come we have two people from Queens could be so different? I don't know.
Well, most of Queens was developed in the first half of the 20th century as these were sort of dormitory neighborhoods for the immigrant working class. But the far sections of Queens, some of them became sections where large homes, mansions were built, and Donald Trump grew up in such a mansion. It was a mansion. I think it had like 20 rooms or something of that sort. I, on the other hand, grew up in Jackson Heights, and I lived in Woodside when my family was evicted from our apartment in Jackson Heights. But Jackson Heights at that time was a neighborhood of Irish, Italian, and Eastern European Jewish immigrants. And on my street, we all lived in these were buildings with 4 apartments, and they were sort of cheek by jowl. And in each of these apartments, typically, there would be a grandmother and a grandfather, a mother and a father, and then the children. These were 3-generation families. And the older generation usually spoke Italian, or if they were Irish, of course, they spoke English. There was a lot of Yiddish and a lot of Italian spoken on the street. I remember the family across the street, the Caponettas, and Francinetta and Johnny Caponetta, and Francinetta actually married my cousin, and my best friend was Joni Houlihan. And Joni and Bobby Houlihan lived in the same building, but in the sort of parallel apartment to us. And what we did, my sister and I shared a little bedroom, and Joni and Bobby shared a little bedroom. And we both, on warm nights, we both escaped through our windows down the door to the coal bin. Because these buildings were heated by coal. So you could slide down the door to the coal bin and get out and run around in the alleys.
Now, speaking of building heat, we hear the radiator hissing right now. Claudia, I want just pan over. It might be a good time to just take a look at this beautiful apartment that we're in, that just is where Francis lives. Now, these old apartments in Morningside Heights, they have these like radiators, old radiators hissing away, and this beautiful room that we're in, it's just such a joy and pleasure to be here. This is a very intellectual place to be in the world. I know Hannah Arendt lived in this neighborhood at one time, I understand. We have Columbia University nearby. Show the other room, honey, just to show it around, if that's okay. We just want to show, what a beautiful, yeah, we want to just see here on our show. We like to give you a holistic experience to the audience about where we are in New York, on the upper left side of Manhattan. We say the upper west side, upper left side. A lot of great liberals up here, and Francis, you are the queen of the upper left side. I do think. Okay, so growing up in Queens, then, and then how did you develop as an intellectual? What were some of the key experiences, the books you read, the teachers you had that made you decide to be an intellectual?
I think I inherited it from my mother and my father. My brother, neither of whom had any formal education. I think they went to school for a year or two, maybe, in a shtetl in Belarusia. And so they didn't have formal education, but they spoke several languages, but not the classical languages. They spoke Yiddish. They spoke and wrote Yiddish. My father also spoke and wrote Hebrew, something I didn't know until I got married and I went to a Seder at my in-laws' house. And I was quite amazed when my father could read the Haggadah. And they also spoke and wrote Russian. My mother, I remember, was proud of the fact that she could read and write Russian, which of course my father could as well. They spoke Belarusian, and they could speak and read and write English. And those were languages that they acquired as a result of their immigrant experience, not as a result of education. Nevertheless, there is this Jewish tradition, I'm not sure, but they were very oriented toward the book, very oriented toward the book. And when my brother, sister, and I all went to public school in Queens, but it was our grades were so important in my household. And I and my sister, we were forbidden. We were not allowed to read comic books. It was,
No Wonder Woman, no Superman.
if you got caught reading a comic book, you were in serious trouble.
Big time.
Now, but at the same time, there were no books in our household. I mean, this was a pretty impoverished household, impoverished materially and in a sense, maybe culturally, but nevertheless, the insistence on being good in school and paying attention to the written word. And it's also true that my father, from the time I was maybe 3 or 4, my father was a very dour man. And so he didn't fool around with kids. He talked politics to them. And so I had a sort of crude political education from a very early age. And I think my brother and sister did as well.
Wow. Well, we're so blessed to have you on our show today, because what this show really is, Fran, and for people watching, I'm escaping from the academy. I'm really, my background is I'm an English professor, and I love teaching. I love teaching and learning. I consider myself more of a radical teacher, trying to connect social justice to helping people find their voices in the English classroom. That doesn't jive well with my administrators these days. It seems that the universities are becoming more corporatized. So I really first discovered you by going to the Left Forum, which I started doing like around 2000, which is one of the great, was at least anyway, and still I think may be, one of the great places for intellectual culture and life and discussion. And it was around the time when I was beginning my career as an educator. So I stumbled into this Left Forum. And then I met one of your students, Bertram Miller, dear man, who had this, still has this group that meets in diners in Manhattan that discuss politics. And for me, that was like a real introduction to this sort of New York intellectual life, which as a hick growing up in New Jersey, I had no experience with that. And so I've been developing since then and writing and reading. And this show is really, we like to see this show as like a university, as an alternative university in itself, that people could watch this and now you could learn something about Frances Fox Pivon, who she is, get her books, read her work, see her YouTubes. Because do you think there's a crisis in the education system today? Am I being paranoid about this, that there seems to be a corporatization that's going on in higher ed?
Well, there certainly is the corporatization of higher ed. Maybe we should wish it were a crisis. It's going forward very smoothly, it seems to me. And it's evident. Think of the changes that have occurred. We have, in the universities, we have incorporated a huge group of precarious workers as faculty, adjunct faculty.
That's me.
Are you an adjunct?
Yes, yes.
Well, one of the principles, usually respected, of university life is academic freedom. And academic freedom, to the extent that it is realized, respected, depends on job security. Adjuncts do not have any job security. They do not have what we call tenure. And moreover, they often don't know what they're going to teach or whether they're going to teach even one semester before. They work for less than minimum wage often because you have to teach 3, 4, 5 courses to earn enough to pay the rent and buy the groceries. So one big change is the huge transformation of the teaching faculty. They are, often a majority of them are now adjuncts. Another big change is the huge expansion of administrators.
Yes. Oh.
And these administrators are so well paid, especially at the top. I remember when Columbia University first hired as president their current president, a guy named Bollinger. He was paid $200,000. I think he now takes home $4 million a year. And these administrators, well, they have they develop, this is a little picturesque, but they develop a kind of consciousness of themselves as a group, a kind of class consciousness. So they like administrators, and they hire more administrators, and provosts hire vice provosts. And all of these administrators, they're a kind of group defense against the faculty, especially the tenured faculty. And these administrators have been responsible for connecting the university to for-profit contractors who provide services for the university. So that now, if you're a tenured faculty person, you're likely to get all sorts of forms to fill out having to do with the promise of some for-profit contractor that they are somehow monitoring, managing what goes on in the classroom. So I get forms asking me what are the objectives or what are the goals, or sometimes they ask what are the objectives and then they ask what are the goals. I have no idea what the difference is between the two. But just often nonsense work.
Right.
Many meetings, it absorbs the time of faculty, preventing them from doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is teaching students and doing their own research or their own creative work. It's a very big change in the university. And we have urban universities who are big landholders, like Columbia University or NYU, that are now in the real estate business on a big scale. That also is not conducive to the pursuit of learning, to the idea that universities are responsible for preserving our inherited culture and passing it on to the next generation.
And the loss of critical thinking, the connection between learning, between education and democracy. That's a big thing for us. We recently filmed a roundtable at NYU with some wonderful scholars there. I'm a graduate of the English education program at NYU, where I learned about Paulo Freire and John Dewey and all these great critical thinking ideas that connect the state of a democracy to the educational system, that you learn to speak out, you learn to speak truth to power, you learn something about history and politics, you learn something about the history of the left, of the labor movement, and all of that is going by the wayside, and we're very, very concerned about that. And if it wasn't for my wife, Claudia, I wouldn't be able to make this show. I wouldn't be able to write. She really supports me as an adjunct, and the reality is that I'm being squeezed out of academia because in the places where I've taught, whenever I open my mouth in the faculty meeting and talk about, oh, this is a good idea, why don't we try this, and oh, my students love this, oh, they don't like what the students like, they like what, it's a very authoritarian kind of thing, and then the chairs become like little dictators where they can fire and hire at will, and it's really horrible. So we're really glad that you're with us here today so we can rethink not only the educational structures, but also the media, and having a different kind of media, a media for critical thinking, to have people like you on. Now, I'm so glad that you were actually on Lawrence O'Donnell a couple of weeks ago, and I want to give Lawrence O'Donnell an A+. And I read somewhere that Lawrence O'Donnell was a teacher, so I think the teacher, that's a good thing that you did, Lawrence. But we need to see more of people like you and have this go out there. Do you think there may be a connection between the political crises of the past several decades, when you see the inequality of wealth that keeps getting worse? Robert Reich's been talking about that, with casino capitalism, the financialization of the economy, and a population of people who have been miseducated, who've been dumbed down.
Well, there is the problem of poor educational capacities, and that's certainly a problem. But there's another problem that seems to me, in a way, so huge that it in a sense, overshadows the fact that our schools are not very good, and our public life is not very educational. And that is the problem that politics has become so complex, and it is deliberately obscured as well, that a kind of fundamental precept of democracy cannot be observed. And that fundamental precept is that people have to be able to observe and understand what their rulers are doing in order to effectively use whatever capacity they have for voting and putting representatives in power. Now, if you go back to the American Revolution and the ideas of the radical Democrats, they had several ideas for making the vote effective. One was that legislators should not be in power for more than a year. They wanted to have another election every year so they could kick the bastards out.
Get them out of there. Get them out.
But the other was that they wanted to be able to see and to listen to what their legislators did. And they wanted to be able to listen and to watch because they could therefore understand what they did. Now, this can't be done in a government as complicated and as hidden as a modern government is. And it's not just the United States. Although the United States, being a very big country and very technocratically advanced, probably has more hidden than most other European countries, for example. But we have no way of grappling with that problem so far, and we have to think it through.
You know, there's another guy from Queens, Richard Dreyfuss, who I've been talking to lately, because Richard Dreyfuss, the actor, has a civics project that he's trying to bring back basic civics education in schools and also in the community. It's called the Dreyfuss Civics Initiative, and that's something that I think is another big problem, that people don't talk politics. They don't talk politics in the community. They don't talk politics in the classroom. There's such a polarization now. You know, somebody says something, another person just immediately argues. We get sound bites from TV, right? It's such a crisis in education and misinformation. How do we even begin to repair this?
Big question. But in approaching the question, I think we have to be discerning and honest about what civics education was like when we had civics education. Because I went to the public schools of New York City, and I had a civics class, and it was ridiculous. Just ridiculous.
Richard Dreyfuss, pay attention to this. Okay.
Never mind grade school. Even undergraduates in colleges and universities. They go to courses on American politics, for example, and essentially they learn how wonderful American political institutions really are. Our checks and balances, our opportunities for democratic participation, our complex system of representation, which ensures that all voices are heard. That is not a fair picture of American democracy. And a fairer picture would include scrutiny of the authoritarian impulses in American politics, of the way in which government has been put to the service of big concentrations of property, of the importance, the criticality of the uprisings by ordinary people in making government a little bit honest. That's not what we learn in American Politics 101, and it certainly isn't what we learn in your typical civics class. So tell Richard Dreyfuss about that.
I will. Okay, he's going to watch this. This is your homework assignment, Richard. Read Francis Fox Pivon. So talk a little bit, Fran, if you can. I call you Fran, is that okay? Fran, thank you. If I could talk a little bit about the intellectuals you've admired over the years and some of the people you've worked with. I know people like Noam Chomsky, Cornel West, just to throw some names, Howard Zinn. America has a great intellectual tradition on the left, and you're right in there. Can you talk a little bit about some of your colleagues, allies, even enemies, if you want to?
I think the friend I admired most, even though I didn't always agree with him, was Howard Zinn.
Okay.
Now, I didn't meet Howard until I was about 40 years old, and I went to Boston University. And at Boston University, I was assigned an office next door to Howard, and we got to be very good friends. We would go out to get, I loved vanilla milkshakes and bacon, lettuce, and tomato sandwiches. And so did Howard.
Okay.
So until the time came when he was warned to stay away from that kind of food. but at the beginning it was okay. And so, when I came to work, I would have to climb over the student bodies that were on the floor waiting to see Howard. And So Howard, what drew me to him was that he was a kind of alter ego. You could, and even after I left Boston University, Howard and I would talk on the phone all the time, and I always had to know Howard's opinion on any political issue that seemed to me to have a moral dimension as well as a strategic dimension. It wasn't that I always agreed with him, and I often didn't, but I had to know what Howard thought, and rethinking whatever it was that I had concluded. And I love that man, and I had a lot of respect for him, for his work as well. Now, the interesting thing about Howard is he got, in his older years, he got to be very well known for The People's History of the United States, a book that he was writing when I was at BU. And that book was a kind of sleeper. I think it was, the publisher originally put out a few thousand copies, and eventually it sold in the millions. But the interesting thing about that book was that historians, including left historians, generally scorned it. They were very, very, yes. It was hard to find an established historian, even on the left, who would credit that book with being valuable history. And that always puzzled me, because it's true that it wasn't a comprehensive history, but it didn't set out to be comprehensive. What Howard was setting out to do was to tell the seamy side of American history from the view of the bottom, people at the bottom. And the book should be read and appreciated for what it sets out to do, and he says that very, very clearly. But the book is always being criticized for not being comprehensive, for leaving out the critical role of elites or whatever. And, I finally came to the conclusion that there was not only bias, but a kind of venom in this criticism, born maybe of envy, because as the book sold more and more and more and more copies.
Wow, look at that, wow. I want to get to this mystery of why Glen Beck was so angry at you. I think this is something that America should know, because this went on for months and even years, where Glen Beck, when he had his TV show, right, he would get up there with his blackboard and he would draw these diagrams and say, okay, Francis Fox Pivon is the enemy of democracy, and all these arrows, and goes back to the 60s to this Cloward-Piven Strategy, and who knows what the heck he was talking about there. What was the Cloward-Piven Strategy, and how did they get people so pissed off?
Well, the Cloward-Piven Strategy was an article that Richard and I wrote that was published.
Husband Richard.
Yes,
Okay.
my longtime collaborator, and eventually my husband. We published it in The Nation in 1966, but before we published it in The Nation, we mimeographed maybe thousands of copies. Nobody remembers mimeograph machines anymore, but that was how you did sort of home production, home publishing. And so we mimeographed copies, and we tried to circulate our idea to organizers that we knew. There were a lot of organizers in 1965, this would have been. And here's what we proposed. We had done a lot of work, both analyzing the welfare system, but also work with people on welfare. And we had come to the conclusion that the welfare system in the United States, which was a system that depended jointly on federal, state, and local authority and funds, that this system operated in a way that denied millions of people who were formally entitled to welfare, denied them benefits. They could not get access to the system. They were not permitted to apply to the system. Or many of those who were on welfare did not get full benefits. And we, in our analysis, we thought that this underutilization of welfare, this sort of tightening of welfare, was necessary for, in a way, the political relationships on which local government, state government, and federal government depended, and on their relationships to each other, on the relationship of each level of government to the other. Now, this was 1965-66. It was in the midst of the movements of the 1960s, including, especially importantly, the Black Freedom Movement of the South and the Black Freedom Movement of the North. And we thought at that point in time, it should be possible to activate social workers, left-leaning lawyers, organizers, and the poor themselves to demand their full legal benefits. And if this were to happen, the financial and political stresses it would create in the cities. They would have to spend a lot more money on welfare at a time when city governments were trying to sort of ride the tensions between the older white ethnic groups and the new Black and Puerto Rican groups. So they would try to, in a way, pass the financial and political stresses up to the state governments. And there was in Washington at that time a very solidly ensconced democratic regime, the Kennedy-Johnson regime. Now, the Kennedy-Johnson regime, the presidential wing of that regime, was elected with urban support, with urban voters, and especially with the margin of minority voters that had recently come to the cities. They would be especially sensitive to this kind of crisis that was building in the welfare system. And the only solution that we thought they could mount would be a solution that would be more generous with federal funds and more inclusive in the procedures of welfare. And ultimately, maybe we would have a response that would approach something like a guaranteed income in the United States. That was the Cloward-Piven strategy. And that strategy attracted enough organizers and enough grassroots interests so that it became the kind of core little Bible of the welfare rights movement. Although it's not exactly the kind of organizing welfare rights did, but that's another story. However, how would Glen Beck, half a century later, know about that?
Exactly.
Well, the reason he knew about it was that in the mid-1960s, we did a lot of writing and some organizing work that was oriented to and committed to the Black Freedom Movement. At this point in time, there were a lot of older sort of liberals, right-wing social democrats, whose core belief was that in the United States, the Democratic Party was the vehicle for progressive politics and ultimately for some kind of social democracy. And that the Black Freedom Movement jeopardized the Democratic Party because it was creating cleavages. After all, the Democratic Party was a majority party in significant part because it commandeered the solid South. The South was the most reliable wing of the Democratic Party.
Right.
And here we, and of course the movement, much more importantly than we, but they couldn't hurt the movement, they could only hurt us. We were championing the movement that was threatening to drive the South out of the Democratic Party, and it eventually did. Now, we, for our part, thought that the Democratic Party could never actually be a progressive force unless the South left the party. So this cleavage was not something that we were unaware of. It was rather something that we thought could be a movement achievement. So at the time, in the mid-1960s, there was enormous hostility from these right-wing social democrats to our work. And these are people like Norman Podhoretz, Irving Kristol, who eventually became neocons. I mean, they didn't stay liberals. But as they were crossing the bridge into the conservative world, they took a lot of pot shots at people who they thought were jeopardizing the Democratic Party route to social democracy. Well, that was then, you would think. And Glen Beck came 45 years later. No, there were still people around who had observed these events and knew about this article and knew about the deep animosity that was developing among the right-wing social democrats, or right-wing social democrats at the time on their way to becoming neocons. There were still people who were burning with the animosities created by that period in our history. One of them was an informant, so to speak, for Glen Beck.
Ooh, a spy.
He wasn't a spy exactly. Okay. This is what he did. And so Glen Beck didn't get the idea. He didn't do the research. He didn't go back into the archives and read 40 or 50-year-old copies of The Nation. He didn't know anything about this period. But the idea that two people were at the center of a conspiracy, and that conspiracy could be said to have led to everything left in the United States in the succeeding generation.
Right.
That's sort of a typical right-wing attack, right? Yeah. Whenever something happens in the universities, who did it? Blame somebody. Yes, blame outside agitators. Our students would be so content and so satisfied if not for a couple of outside agitators. So, when Glen Beck made his chart that he used to put up as a background for his diatribes, he had a tree. The trunk of the tree was labeled Cloward-Piven Strategy. And there were branches off the tree to everything that Glen Beck didn't like about American politics, from SDS to Barack Obama it was ridiculous, just absolutely ridiculous. But there it was. And it was on the air constantly for how long? Very long. Over a year. Yeah. And then it was also in Glen Beck's blog, The Blaze. And The Blaze. Do you know The Blaze?
No, I don't.
You should try to find it. Okay. Google it. The Blaze had issue after issue in which I was on the frontispiece, and my hair was ablaze because I was a witch.
Right, a modern-day witch.
I was a modern-day witch. I remember one afternoon I came home early. It was raining out, and I flipped on the TV, something I never allow myself until evening, but I did. And there was Glen Beck. And Glen Beck was telling a story that moved from an article I had just recently written on the unemployed in the United States and the possibility for mobilizing them, and the demonstrations in Tahrir Square. And I stood there watching this. How did Tahrir Square get to know about my article on organizing the unemployed? And the answer is, because I'm a witch. I can make anything happen. That's how. I flew there on my broomstick. So.
We have some problems in this country to address when it comes to right-wing propaganda and media and things like that, and getting the truth out, getting closer to the truth, so with what's left in the hour, I want to make sure we spend some time talking about the current situation with Donald Trump and your thoughts on that, and how did Trump get elected, and what do you think what do you think about Donald Trump, and what do you think the response should be?
Well, I think Donald Trump is a very dangerous demagogue. His election, maybe it was a freak, taking advantage of certain undemocratic features of the American electoral process, like the Electoral College, for example. But I'm not sure of that. He certainly did appeal to the grievances of a lot of people who don't have good information about politics, who, like most people, find politics both intimidating and boring, and in a way that they don't want to learn. Can you blame them? It just humiliates them to have all those things pushed down their throat. How much easier and at least more immediately gratifying to just cheer Donald Trump on when he calls Barack Obama a Muslim, or says that he has a fake birth certificate, or calls the mainstream media fake news. Yeah. I mean, there were blusterers and bullies like that in my grade school class. They always sat at the back of the room, man spread like that, and basically harassed the teacher. They were all on their way to becoming little Donald Trumps. But Donald Trump's peculiar personality, I don't think he's crazy. I think he has a personality disorder. He's something of a psychopath, has no conscience about what he does, and he also is extraordinarily narcissistic. That explains some of what he's done. Wow. But that's not our problem, or it's not our only problem anymore. Donald Trump did win the election using a very demagogic campaign and using the weak features, the undemocratic features of the American electoral system. And once he was ensconced, he has welcomed into the ruling regime some of the most dangerous interest groups in the American political system, including the fossil fuel industry, including the financial industry, and including the alt-right, which is extremely dangerous. Now, there's a lot about American political culture that makes us susceptible to the Trump kind of demagoguery. We are a xenophobic nation, or even when we overcome our xenophobia, it can be revived easily by a demagogue like Trump. And can we put?
Okay.
You know, the sort of conventions of American political science, which give us, presumably give us assurance that we can't be subject to this kind of authoritarian coup d'etat.
Yeah.
Those conventions are not working so well. For example, Americans are always reassured that because of the division of powers between the president and the Congress and the courts, on the one hand, and between the national and state and local government on the other hand, because centers of power are dispersed and they can veto each other, that nothing terrible can happen. Well, that isn't working well because a very right-wing Republican Party has now got pretty unchallengeable control of both houses of the Congress. The courts are always conservative. They're going to become much more conservative after Trump picks a new Supreme Court justice. The Republicans have, thanks to the work of the Koch brothers and their political network, the Republicans now control a majority of the state governments. So we are in a very alarming situation politically, I think. And this despite the fact that public opinion is not behind Trump policies. Right. Just watch the reactions to their moves to dismantle the Affordable Care Act and replace it with their very pernicious health program. So now it's true that Trump's ascendance to power has provoked a very widespread resistance. Yes. Very widespread. The biggest marches, perhaps, in American history, and very spontaneous, too.
Where's your pink hat? Is your pink hat somewhere around here? Do you march?
I marched, but I didn't have a pink hat.
Well, we'll have to get you a pink hat. Okay.
I wasn't prepared.
Okay.
But we have to worry about a couple of things.
Okay.
One is not only our ability to sustain this resistance, but our ability to direct the resistance more strategically so that it interferes directly with what the Trump interests want to do. That's very important, and a lot of people are worried about that. But the second concern I have is with the ability of Trump, given the fact that he controls the bully pulpit and presidential powers, to create the kind of crisis, shock, that will justify his use of much more authoritarian measures in the country. This is something that could happen.
A Reichstag.
A Reichstag fire.
Yeah.
Because Trump knows. Trump is, not only is he terribly thin-skinned and full of vanity for himself, but he also is a kind of slimy strategic player. He knows that he confronts resistance on all sides. If he can persuade the country that we have an enemy within, or an enemy on our shores,
Yes.
people crumple.
Like McCarthy, a new McCarthyism.
It could, a new McCarthyism will come afterwards.
Right.
First will come the shock.
Right.
And that will be followed by the roundups, not only of undocumented or undocumented immigrants and green card holders, but the roundups of lefties. That's not exactly a prediction, it's a worry. But I see that as such an inviting path for a Trump crowd under siege.
Scary thought, very, very scary thought. There was that book by Sinclair Lewis, It Can't Happen Here, which had to do with a kind of American-style fascism. There was a book by Philip Roth also. I forget the title now. Philip Roth wrote a book about this idea that we could have a fascism here. So all of this is very scary, and we will try to pray to God that this will not happen.
No,
also,
you have to not pray to God.
Wait a minute, hold it.
Pray to God, but you have to join the resistance in whatever ways are possible for you. That means at your school, that means in your neighborhood, it means through the women's organizations like Planned Parenthood, it means by supporting the civil liberties organizations like the Center for Constitutional Rights and the ACLU, it means going on strike. It means you have to make the path, you have to block the path that they want to take. There's no guarantee that we will succeed in that, but we have to do that. We have to try.
Oh, thank you so much for that, Frances. We're so blessed to have you on our show. We have about 6 minutes left. My darling wife, Claudia, who is from Bogota, Colombia, and I always like to give her a big shout out because without her, the show would not exist. That's something about the power of love and power of, I know, you with your wonderful husband, Richard Cloward, you had the strategy together, so that was a product of a couple, a relationship. We like to say that on our show, that love is very important. Paulo Freire said we need to teach for a world that's easier to love, and we agree with that. What's next, Frances? What's going on in your life, and what's happening now in terms of your work intellectually, academically, as an activist, as a teacher? What's in the spring? What's your spring agenda?
Well, we certainly, maybe we can make plans for the spring, but we certainly can't make long-term plans because unlike any other period in American politics, there is so much that we don't know, and there's so much that is unpredictable. We don't have historical parallels to draw on for insight into how this period will unfold, how the Trump regime will perform, and how Americans will react. So we have to take one step at a time. But in the meantime, I think that we have to join the resistance in whatever form that it's joining is available to us, wherever we are. And we have to have a very inclusive idea about the resistance. We have to stop doing what we always do on the left, which is discerning who has the right angle, the right theory, the right strategy, the right credo. We have to accept all of our allies and love them, and support their issues. So that means we work with immigrants, including undocumented immigrants, in a sanctuary movement. It means we work to resist the big cuts that are coming in what programs are left for the poor in the United States, particularly Medicaid, but not just Medicaid. That's Paul Ryan. Always remember that Trump is just the chief clown and actor and demagogue. He is not the regime. So Paul Ryan is the one who's the mastermind of the congressional legislation, which is likely to be coming down on our heads. And we have to be ready, I think, or try to prepare ourselves, because we're not used to that in this country, for very tough actions, because these people are playing hardball. And you know, when you think about it, there are groups among them who have to play hardball Think about the fossil fuel industry, for example. Their wealth is mainly underground still.
Right.
If they can't take it out of the ground and burn it and poison us, they're not wealthy. Now, that's a situation that could make this clique desperate. And desperate people are dangerous people.
And of course, if that oil, if they do bring that fossil fuel out, that could also destroy the planet. It could put us over the edge. Well, Francis, I'm so glad for your discourse here. You bring up a frightening possibility. I want to make sure our passports, are ready. Claudia, where is the I mean, honestly, fleeing may be something that's a rational choice. What if people don't want to fight? What if people don't want to have? Don't you think that there's a certain situation, if we are becoming America with a K, if this is fascist Germany 1933, maybe some people just want to go somewhere else.
Well, that may be, but most of us can't go somewhere else very easily. We have jobs, we have family, we have roots. We've already seen that people do want to fight.
Okay.
They do want to fight.
Well, you are our general. We've got our marching orders now from Francis Fox Pivon on the upper west side, upper left side of Manhattan, and we have a lot of work to do to get our democracy back, and I think that's going to come also later on. Hopefully we'll prevent a major crisis, but then I think what our show is trying to address is also the educational system and the media to transform that so that these kind of crises don't happen again in the future, and to bring a real democracy. But it's such a delight to share time with you at the table. We are at table here with Francis Fox Pivon with a pot of coffee, and we're so happy for your hospitality, Francis. Claudia and I, we enjoy being with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming here and for talking to me.
Okay.
And for filming me.
Yes, thank you. Okay.